note, so if I ramble a little bit, I'll blame it on that. So thank you so much for having me, for inviting me to do this talk. I'm very excited to share this research with you. Wanted to start off by kind of saying and kind of appreciating that we're gathering here on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam. And much of the work that I've been involved with that I'll be talking about today is in collaboration with many of the nations of the Coast Salish. So I want to thank them for sharing their wisdom and being open, kind of letting uninvited guests in and kind of participating in knowledge sharing and building shoreline resilience with them. So for today, I'll talk a little bit about coastal adaptation and why I got interested in that in the region here. I'll talk a little bit about place-based and values-based approaches, what they entail, and then I'll share 4 different projects that I've been loosely involved in, and from there we'll have some key takeaways. So Canada has over or close to 250,000 kilometers of coastline, and it's probably one of the longest coastlines in the world of any country. And if we're thinking about sea level rise and climate change, much of this coastline will change, whether we do this intentionally through design or it's unintentional through coastal erosion or other processes. So there's a huge design project there if you're interested in it. Obviously, many of these parts maybe not that needed to intervene, but there's quite some parts where we have kind of critical habitat and a lot of populations living in close proximity to the coastline. So those might be areas that we want to focus on our energy on. If we're looking at the Fraser River Delta, which is the area that I've been mostly interested in, we have nearly 3/4 of the 250 kilometers of dikes in this region are vulnerable to overtopping from coastal and riverine flooding. And many of these dikes were constructed, in the 70s or even earlier, before there was any sense of kind of climate change or, sea level rise. So many of them do not meet provincial dike heights and design standards. And based on a report now that's about 12, 13 years old, it would cost about $10 billion. That number was probably closer to $20 billion now to reinforce and upgrade these dikes, should this actually be the right thing to do, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that are not that great about dikes that maybe, we want to challenge, but there's a lot of money that needs to be spent in order to make sure we're protected and safe. At the same time, this region is growing rapidly. We have a projected growth of 1 million people and 500,000 jobs in the next 20 years. It's very complex jurisdictionally. You have First Nations, you have local municipalities, and you have quasi-governmental agencies such as the airport and the port. It's also part of a Pacific flyway, and the Fraser River estuary already sees over 102 species that are at risk. So this will only kind of exacerbate and become more problematic with climate change and habitat fragmentation due to urban development. So we're kind of facing these wicked problems, like, how do you intervene in this with trying to find win-win scenarios, which are kind of hard to find. So in the work that we're doing, we're kind of really interested in if the thing that I've posed here is that we have to really change our shorelines and our coastlines because we need to accommodate space for water, for more than human species, but also think about how we can protect ourselves. If we have to do that adaptation, we should do that hand in hand with decolonization, really understanding that much of especially in our area here, we are dealing with a lot of stone land. A lot of the nations are living right next to water bodies and rely on them. They're tied to them historically, and they rely on them, and they're connected to them. So how do we kind of come up with projects that are both adaptation, but do that in a way that facilitate decolonization at the same time? So the approach that I found mostly in line with that is a values-based approach. And, values, you can kind of distinguish them in tangible values. So these are things that are tied to physical elements such as salmon, cedar, critical infrastructure, or houses. And these are typically the things when you see adaptation projects, these are the things that are being monetized and are taken into consideration. What's often not taken into consideration is intangible values. So physical and mental well-being, social connectedness, cultural and sure that when we're doing coastal adaptation, we're oh, I don't need my internet, so that's good. That we're both taking these intangible and tangible values into consideration. Because a values-based approach really, the values influence how people perceive risk, how they prioritize actions, and how they then subsequently make decisions. So without knowing and understanding the values of those that we're working with, it's really hard to understand how we can design adaptation solutions that are in line with how communities want to move forward. And so in the work that I've been doing, it's trying to understand how we can bring community priorities, strengths, and needs in the same space as technical and economic considerations. And that's really around kind of the co-creation of solutions that are meaningful, effective, and grounded in place. And that's much of the work that I do with design, is trying to understand what's the place, how do communities want to protect that space, and how can we design over time with those values in mind. So some of the earlier work as part of Living with Water that we did is we looked at these 7 adaptation plans and strategies that are done here in Canada, but also some of them were in Australia and in the US. And it's interesting just to kind of see, like, all of these had values explicitly written out in their adaptation strategies. And you can just kind of see how these provide different entry points into design. If I'm a designer, and I'm probably the only designer in the room, so that's okay. But if I'm thinking about, I need to design with these values in mind, it's going to be a lot different than if I'm designing, for example, like ceremonial spaces, healing spaces, how do I design for men and women, versus like, how do I design to protect infrastructure or to accommodate the environment? So this is just to say that I think kind of understanding how values, like what are the values, what starting point are we are starting from, is really going to shape kind of design decision making. So I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to walk through 4 different projects that all have been influenced and guided by values. And I'd say, like, the first project, the Swinomius Clam Garden, I've not really been involved with, other than that I've been interested in clam gardens. We've done some drawings and research on them, and the other ones have been part of the Living with Water projects, except for the last one, the Ditch to Delta project. It's a MITEX funded project that some students are working with professional firms on. And so I'll walk through each of these, and hopefully it gives you a sense of what a values-based approach can bring to coastal adaptation. So first is Swinomius Clam Garden. It's an Indigenous-led project restoring an ancient maricultural practice in Kiket Island, just south of the border from here. And it's really framing this idea of responding to kind of sea level rise and habitat degradation and food insecurity. So I'll show you in a little bit how the clam gardens are constructed, but what is interesting about this is that there used to be clam gardens in their territory, and much of that knowledge has been lost. And so this is a very tiny project. It's only 200-meter long clam garden, so it's not very big. But the idea, and you can see it here, is that it was completely constructed by the community, and as a way to bring community together, to kind of relive some practices that have been lost, but also to blend Indigenous knowledge with Western science as part of the monitoring of the project. And so the values here are embedded as part of their initial plan and for which they kind of develop these health indicators. And interesting here to kind of forward here and foreground here that the values such as self-determination, education, and cultural use were very important for them. So again, like these are not tangible values, these are intangible. And so this is a type of project that really foregrounds these intangible values. So clam gardens are these rock wall terraces. They're engineered to optimize clam habitat. So they're constructed at the lowest low tide line in the intertidal zone. And so every time at high tide, there's fine sediment that comes in. And as the water recedes, it kind of deposits that fine sediment behind that rock line, creating an optimal clam space for clams. And clams, and with it come other species as well. So the clams then are tended for and are harvested and then become an important food source. And they're also kind of an important multi-species community. So if clams are doing well, it often means that other species are doing well at the same time. And the rock walls themselves, they help with wave attenuation. So it's also kind of a climate change adaptation project at the same time. So this is a way of showing how the clam gardens are constructed. So often you have a fairly steep original beach construction. The rocks are then gathered, and there's a construction of the wall at the base at the lowest low tide line. Over time, sediment builds up, and through kind of tending and harvesting and aerating these types of practices, the clam beds actually become very productive, and it becomes a ceremonial, educational, and food security space. At the same time, as you can see, it has extended the beach and kind of prevented further erosion of the beach site. So the site selection for this one was done based on both the cultural indicators, kind of indigenous knowledge of oral histories of where these clam gardens used to be, as well as Western scientific data had kind of identified the best location for this based on the shape of the beach and the intertidal zone. It's really like an intergenerational participation as part of this practice. So it really brought together elders, knowledge holders, and then youth and community that were all together participating and putting this project together. And it's really about kind of stewardship. So it's not so much about kind of bringing in trucks and heavy equipment to kind of set it and forget it, but it's really a space that's going to be evolving over time. And so it's really a social cohesion project. It's a project that really restores identity of the community. And at the same time, I think it's a pilot project that is very important because there's many communities here in the region that want to do something similar. So they're taking kind of a leap here, doing this type of project and seeing kind of generating knowledge that can be used elsewhere. So the second project, which is somewhat connected to this, is the Tsleil-Waututh Shoreline Adaptation Project. So this is a project as part of the Living with Water project that Hannah mentioned. That's funded by PICS. It is a 4-year project. It was $1 million. And we're basically at the end of the project. We got a couple more months left. But it was a really big project and many collaborators. Stephanie is in the audience here. Yeah, it's been fantastic to kind of connect. And Charlotte, I see you here as well. It's been awesome to kind of connect Indigenous communities, that's Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, as well as we've been working with the city of Vancouver, with the city of Surrey, and then with the province. So it's basically been trying to share knowledge and practices around coastal adaptation. And this particular project focused on this 500-meter strip in front of the Tsleil-Waututh Reserve that's also facing heavy erosion from sea level rise, as well as wave generation due to ship traffic in the Broad Inlet. And we initially developed a range of options for this in collaboration with the community. And we started really trying to understand what the vision and the values for this project were. So through a series of workshops and shoreline walks, and we had some dinners with community members. These were the types of values that came about. So leadership, resilience, food security, stewardship, habitat, recreation, health, connection, and knowledge. Again, like a mix of both tangible and intangible values were driving this. And the other thing which they were very interested in, which kind of ties back to also the Swinomis project, is this idea of trying to understand how ancestral technologies, as I like to call them, such as clam gardens, root gardens, forest gardens, and shell middens, could be integrated as part of this project. So they weren't that interested in just dikes or seawalls. They wanted to try to understand, like, how can we bring these practices back as we're adapting our coastlines. And so this is the work that came out of kind of a subsequent phase. So after our initial involvement, the community was able to secure a $10 million grant that they then hired this interdisciplinary team led by landscape architects and engineers. And they've been further developing this with the community. So this is the project that's currently moving forward towards construction. And kind of the nice thing about this is that it's basically in a very small space, trying to practice a range of different coastal adaptation techniques that are largely inspired by these kind of ancient technologies. So habitat gardens, there's shell middens, there's these root gardens, and then there's forest gardens up top. And it moves basically from more secluded, so this is more private, there's the cemetery here, to the canoe shed is up there, to more public, where there's part is access and access for the community, and other ones are more habitat focused and a little bit more sheltered. The great thing here is that this is like really like an Indigenous-led project. So this was initiated by the Tsleil-Waututh and completely, they've taken the initiative to work with both the city of North Van, or the district of North Van, and the port. And, I think they're driving the agenda, which is great. Whereas often what we're seeing is that municipalities are leading these projects and then bringing the nations in, which is often kind of watering down their, I think, desires and what they want. And so this is kind of a great example of kind of Indigenous leadership in this space. It's kind of integrating those ecological and cultural values as part of shoreline protection. And it's really moving away from kind of typical dikes and seawalls. And it's actually showing what our shorelines could look like in a much more diverse and healthy way. And another project that I think is quite interesting, this project actually was not implemented. This is kind of a challenge that was really stimulating us to think differently about what the inner city of Vancouver could look like, as a Sea to City Design Challenge, which was led by the city of Vancouver. They have already done quite some adaptation projects, but as part of they kind of constructed these 5 points that they're interested in. So meaningfully involving host nations in the planning and implementation of their coastal adaptation, embracing living with water and building kinship with the dynamics of water. This is kind of a coordinated effort. So what you often see in these adaptation projects, it's either within planning or within parks. And here they brought all the city departments together. So there's more efficiency and coordination between the different entities. And it also recognizes that human systems can fail. So I think it really started to think about how do you build in redundancy into the system. So we're not relying on just a dike or a seawall, but maybe you have setback areas or you're retreating in areas that are prone to flooding. Again, engagement is very important. So not so much doing the engagement when decisions are being made, but doing a lot of engagement up front in order to understand what communities would like to see as part of the project. And for this particular project, they created a cultural advisory group. So this was made out of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And so they already assisted the planning and design teams as kind of foregrounding the Indigenous knowledge and how that could drive their agenda. A key takeaway from this project, I don't know if many of you are familiar with the PARA framework as when it comes to adaptation, like protect, accommodate, retreat, and avoid. And there's a lot of written about this, but these terminologies are often quite military in the way that they sound and also how they're explained. And so the cultural advisory group, in collaboration with the designers, were really kind of interested in like, how can we reframe and come up with different types of words that embody a more reciprocal relationship with water. So they came up, instead of saying protecting, like we should actually acknowledge that water is here and how can we actually live with water, right? So it's not so much about protecting that really puts a focus on kind of a defense system towards water, where it's acknowledging means like, okay, water is here, it's not going to go away. We should actually find ways to kind of interact with it in a sustainable way. Hosting then means like kind of like how can we actually, like when you are a host, you're kind of friendly towards it and you want to make sure that they're having a good time. So how can we make sure that water has a good time in the space and you give it actually the time to breathe and be what it wants to be. And then restore is obviously restoring the relationship that we have towards water, but also restoring what the places that water used to have and was able to be part of. So those words then led to kind of this idea of these principles, like learning from nations, increasing diversity of shoreline experiences, respecting the natural forces. So like probably moving a lot of critical infrastructure out of the floodplain. And then also trying to think about like, what do we do with housing that's, currently in these spaces, and then practicing adaptation over time. Another key thing that came out of this challenge was this idea that, and this is maybe more towards design, but designers often tend to come up with different options. And these options are kind of standalone options. What they were discussing as part of this project is that actually these options are linked and based on kind of information, so like adaptive pathways, we can change direction over time. So maybe if you start with acknowledging that water is here, maybe over time you can move towards hosting that water, and then you can move towards restoring your relationship. And this might be like this, or it might be this way. Like there's probably different ways that you kind of move through as we learn more about climate change and its implications. But it's all part of one scheme rather than they're separate schemes. And as part of this, they also kind of developed these prototypes or kind of ideas of these low-tech solutions that are really inspired and based on these indigenous technologies that have been here. So this is a cedar berm. So rather than maybe a normal dike, we can think about creating spaces that create habitat, but also ceremonial spaces, and at the same time can hold back water. And they were really pushing the city to start thinking about futuring. So, we have a lot of development right now within the floodplain, but potentially we can move that development higher up. So along First Avenue, which is out of the floodplain, and we can densify there and free up the shoreline for ecological functions and cultural connections towards water. And this doesn't have to be, doesn't need to happen in the next 10 years, but if you plan for it, a lot of housing stock is going towards the end of its lifespan. So rather than rebuilding it in place, maybe we can rebuild it in other locations. Obviously, this is a whole range of questions about like relocation and a lot of the communities there, their social housing. So a lot of questions there that need to be answered. But I think as a push towards the city to kind of think about the area that's probably the highest amount of real estate value within Vancouver, to think about maybe we don't build there, but we create kind of this ecological heart of the city. It's quite a statement, and I think it's been effective in that sense that the city is kind of thinking differently about this space now. And then lastly, how am I doing on time?
Yeah, 30 seconds, and
Oh.
then it'll be 5 minutes. So you have 5 minutes.
Okay. I can go through this a little bit faster, but I've been working with a group of students and with some landscape architecture firms on more upstream. So these are two projects. One is in Hope Slough, so this is in relation with Chiam First Nation and Squaw First Nation, and then the city of Chilliwack, and the other one is related to Seabird Island First Nation, and that's Mariah Slough. So these sloughs used to be connected to the Fraser River, but have been diked due to railroads and roads that have blocked up the flow. And a lot of the atmospheric river events were actually because it wasn't because the Fraser was overtopping, but the water from kind of a fluvial event wasn't able to get back into the Fraser River. So there's a lot of need to kind of reconnect these sloughs, these waterways back to the Fraser, and at the same time, create spaces that enhance the water quality, enhance flow, and bring back salmon in these spaces. So this is Hope Slough, and the work really here is focusing towards connecting particularly farmers with First Nations. So here the diagram is basically showing that everything here is important because the headwaters are all the way up in the mountains, and that connects through the slough watershed to the Fraser, and then the Fraser connects to the Salish Sea. So this is critically important for salmon, every part of it. And our engagement with the farmers is primarily because, we've heard from a lot of farmers there. They've been there for generations. A lot of them are Dutch farmers that came here about 100, 120 years ago. And they basically believe that there's no fish in the water because they know that the water is poor. They're just ditches that are made by their grandparents and parents over time, and they know the water quality is bad, so they don't actually believe there's salmon in there. But there is salmon in there. So this drawing is trying to show that we want to create solutions that both help with getting water off the farms quickly so they can improve their yields and don't have to deal with flooding at the edges. But at the same time, if we can create these riparian buffers and enhance them, we can trap sediment, we can trap nutrients, and we can create healthier waters for improved habitat for the salmon. So this ideally there's a win-win, but much of this land is owned by the farmers, and it will have to happen on 50 meters of farmland that they'll have to kind of I wouldn't say give up, but that's how they see it, that they're giving up land in order to accommodate this. So it's a lot of kind of education, and our role is basically in aiding the nations and sharing the story of that the time that the farmers have been here is like a minuscule amount of time of the time that these systems have been alive. So what we've done here is kind of created a narrative of how we've shown how the slough systems have changed over time. So we've drawn and tried to visualize the kind of the cultural activities that used to happen in this space. And at the same time, we used LiDAR mapping and data to kind of show kind of the hydrological network that would have existed here prior to the roads and other systems coming in. And so I won't go through this at all, but we've kind of broken this down in 4 different steps and kind of showing interventions that have taken place and how that has both changed the water quality and the relationship and the feel of the water and the space, as well as on the plan you can see the implementations there. And then we're working with local farmers to develop site-specific solutions for their properties to try to understand how we can clean up their sites or the water that's coming off to their site to the slough. And for the Mariah Slough project, which is just upstream from there, as you can see, this is Seabird Island. This is the slough, Mariah Slough, that used to be connected, but there's now the highway and the railroad that have disconnected that site and diked it. And so the entry point here was that in 2021, there was a landslide that basically destroyed part of the Highway 7 there. And the nation got funding to basically create kind of a sediment berm and a sediment pond, but at the same time, they pressed the Department of Transportation that they actually wanted to see a reconnection of the Mariah Slough if they're doing a lot of work there anyway. let's see if we can reconnect it so they can bring the Fraser River back into the system. And so this is what the site looks like right now, the debris flow, and then you can see the Lizzie Lake is this kind of a seasonal wetland, but this is where Mariah's Slough used to be, but it doesn't have a lot of water in it. And so we kind of just used simple visualizations to show what that reconnection could look like. We developed a site-specific plan that the nation could use in their negotiations with Modi to say that this is actually a good idea, with stewardship plans and kind of identifying species that they could also use for harvesting and medicinal uses. Also kind of saying that these spaces are important for salmon and that salmon inhabit these spaces at different time of year. And then kind of drawing out existing conditions and what this would look like. Kind of important to kind of show for that this would not be an open connection all the time. This would be kind of a gate that would be operable. So during high tide level or high river flow levels, they could close the gate, not to kind of flood downstream. This is the other side. And at the same time, we're now working with them to kind of develop a recreational trail system along a part that now will be re-accessible with water. So again, I'm showing working with the land and reintroducing some of the species that are lost in different spaces along the channel. With the fish traps that they're restoring. So I'll just leave it here, just kind of saying this quote here by Leanne Betsumake Simpson, that the land Aki is both context and process, and the process of coming to know is learner-led and profoundly spiritual in nature. And what I've found in working on these projects is that it's fantastic to kind of, they're really about place, and they're really about understanding what's best for place based on the communities that have been working and living on these lands since time immemorial. And it's really understanding about, it takes time to try to, you can't come in and say, like, what are your values? You kind of have to kind of tease out in different ways, whether you're walking with them or you're having dinners or you're doing workshops, and through that kind of learning what is it that's driving their decision making. And then our role, or I see my role, is then trying to visualize what those futures could be, and then trying to help the nations in securing grants or moving that work forward. So thank you so much. And open session.